Hi folks, I'm Dan Peterson, aka Dr. Rockter. This is The Hole on the Corner, and we are continuing our series on locating Lafferty in the literary landscape. And in the previous video, we talked about Lafferty in relation to Native American storytelling and worldview and history that were interests of Lafferty's, and had to do with him living with, sometimes working with, going to school with Native American neighbors. And so now we're transitioning into talking about Lafferty's relationship to the American tall tale, or the frontier tall tale. So moving from the Native American into the tall tale, the frontier type of storytelling, makes me want to mention that how I positioned Lafferty in my dissertation in this regard was to say that rather than, so he came from a homesteading family, as I've mentioned before, who were literally homesteaders on the Oklahoma frontier, quote unquote frontier, when the government just moved it from Indian territory into this new thing, and they had a land rush or run where it opened up and you could just come and claim and file on acres of land and so on, and that's what Lafferty's family did. So he has that sort of settler perspective. I mean, anyone who's from European people has that settler perspective to some degree, but he has, quite literally, he's born into that in 1914, and that's like underway in his family. But at the same time, he absorbed so much from the Native American worldview and so on, that I think this is one of the things I'll talk about, his innovation upon the tall tale. I'll say more about that in a moment, but for the moment, I just want to say that what I think it creates in Lafferty is what I called in my dissertation unsettler fiction. A fiction that's from a settler perspective, but not completely comfortable with that, and that in interesting ways kind of critiques and in some ways subverts that point of view. I won't say that he outright, sort of consciously rids himself of a European or settler sort of perspective. I mean, how could you? But I don't know that his critique is massively overt and this kind of thing, but it's definitely sort of in his bones, as it were, and comes through in the way he does his fiction and the way he incorporates tall tale and so on. So that's what we're talking about this time, as well as moving on to talk about Lafferty as just a general writer of U.S. Western literature. So I have another collection here by Erdos, and it has his drawings again, which this time I can endorse a little more, because I wasn't sure about him kind of doing drawings about traditional Native American stories or whatever, but these are like frontier tales, and so we get a lot of more cool illustrations. I really like his style. I think it's pretty fun. It's funny, I actually like it a little better in the Native American ones, even though I'm not so sure about them. But in this frontier tall tale type style, it is definitely based on, in large part, on humor, or completely. It's definitely about humor and stuff, folk laughter on the American frontier, and these sorts of things. It's definitely about that. But like Native American storytelling, it's humorous, but can be quite grotesque. There's violence and so on. A lot of this had to do with, the vicissitudes of frontier life, be it, hunting and so on, or, outlaws or whatever it may be. A lot of man versus nature type stuff, I would say, in the tall tales. And there's also like spooky stuff, again, resonating with Native American stuff. So while there are resonances with Native American storytelling in European settler storytelling, August, stop. So while there are resonances between American frontier tall tale storytelling and Native American storytelling, one of the big differences is that whole man versus nature type of aspect to it, where certainly Native Americans are interacting with land and fauna and so on. I'm not sure I'd ever really call it in a competitive way or a sort of conquering sort of way at all. But certainly there's hunting and so on, and there can be vicissitudes, violent vicissitudes and so on. But, it's a different, perspective. And it's often been talked about as sort of, there's the westward expanding sort of perspective of the settlers, and then there's this ancient dweller eastward facing sort of perspective from those who already lived there. And their relationship to their land is really quite different. So, and there are heroics in both sets of tales, but the heroics of the frontier are about sort of conquering and dominating the land and making it kind of fit what they expect of it, what they want to get out of it, which is, larger and larger and larger scale farming and development and that kind of thing. So that, there's that fuels kind of what's happening in American tall tales. So it's no surprise then one of the most famous tall tale figures is John Bunyan, who's a giant that, can sort of fell, a whole forest of trees in a day, or, can take down many trees with one axe blow and all this kind of stuff, or Davy Crockett, shoots 10 or 20 or some vast amount of bears in one go or something like that, and has a big stack of them and these kinds of things. So there's a lot of that violence and conquering of the land, and that's the heroics, and that's the excitement, and that's the thrill of some of these tall tale heroic figures, larger than life figures, who are, humanity writ large over against non-humanity. And that's what's going on in a lot of the tall tales, and just lots of other funny stuff about just kind of surviving, kind of tough conditions on the frontier and these sorts of things. And that's one of the main ways I would say that Lafferty innovates upon the tall tale, is that he does almost none of that that I can really think of. There's no heroic feats about sort of homesteading and I don't know, clearing forests or fighting animals or whatever it may be. That just almost that I can really think of doesn't exist in Lafferty's fiction, but it does have that tall tale quality of these sort of wild, exaggerated things happening in the landscape and so on. And if anything, Lafferty, and this is where that unsettler quality comes in, if anything, Lafferty kind of reverses that. I call it a land rush reversal, where the land rushes back upon the colonizers and colonizes them, so to speak. And one of the clearest tales for this kind of thing is always going to be his most famous sort of Native American-oriented tale, Narrow Valley, which I've already mentioned several times, but it just continues to be, just that kind of fruitful example. But, where the valley itself that is owned by this Native American man, it sort of topologically folds in a way that it looks like a ditch to any homesteaders that try to settle on it. And they're like, where is this piece that's described in the file or whatever? And when a family does go down into it, it expands for a while, but then it contracts again and it flattens them in a very cartoon-like way. And it talks about them, being eaten up by the valley and these kinds of things. So, I think that's, so it's tall. It's this impossible thing but instead of something humans do to the land, it's something the land does to the humans. So I think that's probably the main thing I'm really going to say for now about Lafferty's innovation upon the frontier tall tale. But it's a big one. I mean, that's a big deal to use that tall tale form of exaggeration and impossible feats, but to ascribe that largely to non-humans and the effects it has on humans. And as I've said before, this is a great, more contemporary, 70s collection, Shingling the Fog and Other Plains Lies. And I've talked about the whole lie aspect that, Native Americans call a lot of their storytelling lies, and their storytellers are liars and this kind of thing. Well, similarly with tall tales, they're called that. And of course, this is, on the plains, where I locate Lafferty bioregionally, the sort of Great Plains and Southwest. As I've mentioned before, the other thing that, it's not an innovation, but, well, it is. We'll talk about this in a moment, but the the key thing I think about Lafferty and his relationship to tall tales is he grew up around oral storytelling on that homestead. He talks about how there was this like country store or supply store that a guy set up, and there wasn't much to do. So everybody from like all around, because everybody's just flocking into Oklahoma. So you get all these different types of people, including Native Americans, standing around with nothing really to do except swap stories, swap these tall tales, these like wildly exaggerated stories. And so, and his family, he says his father was really good at it, and his mother gleaned a lot of Native American storytelling from Native American students that she's taught as a school teacher. And he just talks about how like that was just kind of what he breathed, you know, oral storytelling of both Euro settler and Native American varieties, you know, and you can tell it just kind of comes through. And he called Oklahoma a mixing bowl of these different, you know, iterations of tall tale. He thinks it kind of almost uniquely had more of that cross-fertilization going on than any other part of the states. And so he incorporates that oral aspect into his writing directly, okay? So like, you've got this like collection here, and he does that more, I would say, than maybe any other writer. Tall Tales of the Southwest. And these are largely, some good stuff in here, these are largely the newspaper tall stories that would arise after or during the frontier times, but sort of after everything's underway. And after the oral storytelling is already happening, because largely speaking, it was men from out east would come over and to the frontier and report back like, oh, you got to hear these stories they tell. And so you would often have like a framed narrative where the newspaper man is there and he sets up the scene, and then he focuses in on one person that then tells the story in their voice, you know, and that kind of thing. And Lafferty does do a lot of characters telling stories within the story. In a different way, though, there's no setup by a narrator usually. It just kind of happens, and it happens a lot. But furthermore, and more important, more to the point, I think, is that the narrator in Lafferty's stories usually is that raconteur, that like wisecracking tall storyteller. And so that's why you'll find, and you may have wondered about it at first, you're like, why is he talking to the audience all the time? Why does he like look at the reader and go and like ask a question, or, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And that's because the narrator is the raconteur. So you're directly there. You're at the campsite where they're telling the tales, or at that supply store where they're telling the tales, and hearing directly from the storyteller. And I do think, I'm not sure how many other people, if any, you know, really did that with the tall tale. So, and as it says, the Southwest here, and as I've mentioned before, you know, Oklahoma is weirdly situated in regard to the Southwest. Not weirdly, but just, you know, interestingly situated. So you've got this humor of the old Southwest, right, which is tall tales and funny storytelling and so on. And the old Southwest, I don't remember exactly which states it comprised, but it definitely was Texas and Oklahoma, I think Louisiana and places like that. So that, you know, that was the frontier before it expanded further west, and that was what they called the Southwest, and that's where a lot of the storytelling arises. So Lafferty's Oklahoma's kind of situated with that old Southwest, but a little bit in the new Southwest too, because the Panhandle often gets included in Southwest is usually just Arizona and New Mexico, but even contemporary sort of cartographies of the Southwest will include more than those two states, and a bit of Colorado, the Oklahoma Panhandle, and these kinds of things. So, you know, the Oklahoma, I would say, is contiguous with the Southwest for sure. And the way bioregionalism works is that it's defined beyond sort of state borders or any kind of political or otherwise, you know, human sort of demarcations, and is defined more by what's happening naturally with landforms and bodies of water and flora and fauna, weather patterns, and all these kinds of things. So that you know, the bioregion, you know, there's a slip from the Southwest into Oklahoma where you even have some of the same, unique fauna to these places. Like one of the animals that Lafferty's always mentioning is kit foxes, which I'd never heard of in my life till I started reading Lafferty. And I just thought it was just at first I think I just thought it was Lafferty's term for foxes or something, because he makes up a lot of stuff. And then I thought, oh, it's a local thing or whatever, but it's a different species of fox that only exists in a certain area out there in the West. As I recall, it's one of the ones that's shared with, Arizona, New Mexico. So, there's all that kind of stuff that makes him a Southwestern writer as well as a Great Plains writer. One of the things also about the tall tale that is of interest to me is that it has this interesting connection directly really to the monstrous, to monsters and the monstrous, particularly in contemporary monster theory, in that, as Carolyn Brown notes in this really, really good study of the tall tale, there's almost no studies of the tall tale. Certainly, I don't know that I've ran across another book-length study of the tall tale, and this is from like the 80s, I think. But she notes that the way these tall tales work when they kind of narrate this sort of exaggeration to, everywhere from improbability to basically the impossible can occur, to where, you get a category mistake. She borrows from this philosopher of mind, Gilbert Ryle, who had this phrase, the category mistake, where you've put two things in the wrong category. Like the smell of a color, is a category mistake. You can't smell colors, that kind of thing. And she uses an example of when basically that there's one that would be told a lot in slightly different ways, where they say that one winter it was so cold that when we tried to shout across to each other outside, our words froze in the air and they didn't thaw out till spring. So that's that category mistake type of thing, which interestingly connects to monster theory, in that Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, who's kind of the progenitor of monster theory, talked about how one of his key ideas is that the monster is a harbinger of category crisis, or category confusion, you would say as well, but category crisis. That's what a monster is in its very form and its nature and its incompatible body parts, et cetera, et cetera. It's this category crisis, this thing it doesn't fit. It's this excess, this monstrosity. And so similarly, the way the tall tale works is it creates these sort of monsters of thought and speech and narrative and so on, just in the sheer way that it works. So that lends itself well to my whole reading of Lafferty as exhibiting an eco-monstrous poetics. And again, these category crises, category confusions, category mistakes are about the non-human world. The weather, for example, in that example. Or here's a great one. I love this kind of stuff where it just really goes pretty wild. There's one that says, somebody's talking about holes, and they say, holes? My grandfather had a well 200 feet deep, but the gravel around it was sandy, and a windstorm blew it away and left the hole up 200 feet in the air. He had his sons-in-law saw it up, and they used it for fence post holes. So, and there's that example of, not only is it a category crisis for starters, then you kind of up the tall lie. You tell a lie on top of the lie and see how high you can stack them. And that was part of the sometimes competitive nature of tall tale storytelling as well. But you've got this idea that a hole in the ground on a particularly windy storm gets blown into the air so that the hole is now up in the sky. It's impossible. That's a category crisis. But on top of that, I wish it would have told more story about how they got it back down again. Maybe there's a different version where they do. But anyway, they get it again, and now that it's, I guess, not in its original place, let's use it for something else. Saw it up and use it for fence posts, holes for fence posts, and I just, wow, that is cool stuff. And I love the way it kind of tricks your mind. It makes you kind of picture these things before you realize you can't picture them. And you're like, oh, and that's part of the fun of the tall tale, and kind of like the raconteur sort of catching you out and that kind of thing. And that's another thing about it too, and about Lafferty addressing the audience, is some people have done some work on it too. There's a guy called Wonnum, Wonham, H-A-M, and I cannot think of his first name. And he writes a book about Twain, and the first chapter is just about tall tales, and is really insightful. So I should have gotten his name ready, but you can figure it out from there. But he talks about how it kind of does this philosophical work. He draws on like, is it Hans Georg Gadamer, who's a philosopher of hermeneutics, and draws on his work to kind of show how the tall tale is in part doing knowledge work amongst a community. It's showing communal knowledge. And that's part of, what happens there is the fellow frontier people are invited to be in on the joke, and they're trying to catch out greenhorns, the visiting newspaper man or whoever it may be from out east or whatever, that doesn't get this kind of humor and storytelling, or doesn't know that a big lie is coming up. Because that's a key thing about the tall tale is, as often as not, it starts with... it can bang right into it in a really short way like it just did, but it also often starts with sort of accurate local detail, and then jumps into the tall lie. And so they would kind of play a game with the greenhorns, the new people, and see if they could catch them out, and then you're invited as the listener in the know to like laugh along. And if you were the greenhorn, you're invited to learn from that and learn how it works and stuff. And so that's a lot of what Lafferty's doing as well, is drawing the reader in to say, let's play this game together. And as I've said before, his main goal in playing that game is world building. It is to co-create the world together at a pretty profound level that's more than just for the storytelling. It's about kind of reconstructing our world now that, in his mind, we've reached this place where there's no consensus anymore on reality. So that means the good part about that is there's no rules. We can just make them up as we go and create whole new modes of fiction or whatever it may be. But anyway, so Lafferty's using the tall tale in that way. So to transition then, and I think, as I said, it reaches its literary apex from the oral to the newspapers, and then to like Mark Twain in a literary way. That's where it like really gets realized, I would say. But one way that Lafferty is distinct from somebody like Twain is because that's the other thing. You either have these Easterners coming out to write about the frontier or Western U.S. Life and place, or you have somebody that grew up there and then moves away to the important cultural centers like New York City or what have you, which is what Twain did. I can't remember if he was in New York or Virginia or what, but he moved out east, and he was from Missouri, and then he wrote about back home, and that's the other mode. You can be a Western person, U.S. Western person, who then writes about the place you don't live anymore. And so Lafferty stayed in Oklahoma all his life, except for his travels and his service in the war or whatever, but that's where he lived. And so he's writing as someone who still lives there, and that places him as a Western author, because the few authors I'm going to look at were people who lived and stayed there. Anyway, there's this book, The Enduring Legacy of Old Southwest Humor in Comic Sans. Okay, but and it's these essays on various, sort of literary writers that and showing the influence of tall tale and general sort of Old Southwest frontier, what have you, sort of a humor, roughhouse sort of humor and all that kind of thing on their literature. And it mentions, for example, Flannery O'Connor. So I think that's an interesting one. Also, Faulkner, which you might be surprised to hear. Like, what is, Faulkner's so, verbose and kind of heavy in his themes and stuff, but people can trace how he's influenced by these things as well. And this is the reason I got the book back when I was doing my thesis, on Cormac McCarthy as well. Cormac McCarthy's Frontier Humor is an essay in here by Edwin Arnold. And, that would be an easy one to miss. Like, you might, if you've, dipped into McCarthy, you might think he's completely humorous, but he's not at all. I mean, the Coen brothers, when they made No Country for Old Men, and you get a few laughs out of that very dark movie, mostly they were drawing on what was already there in McCarthy's fiction, and probably playing it up a bit in there to fit their style. But they had something to work with there. There is definite humor. And it's that Old Southwest frontier type of tall tale humor. And so when we try to place Lafferty in the literary landscape, I think that's what we see is there's actually an established tradition already from Twain and Faulkner onward through to people like O'Connor and McCarthy and so on, that is drawing on that tall tale and or Old Southwest humorous sort of storytelling. And so Lafferty comes along and essentially he's one of them, you know, so you kind of see like he's so sui generis. I should have looked that up before. I'm so bad at pronouncing things, all these sort of intellectual terms. I just read them and then I don't know how to say them. Anyway, he's so original that, you know, it feels a little bit hard to place him or to trace his roots and things, but he actually fits within an American literary tradition there. And then you want to ask, like, okay, so how is he distinct from them? And as I've said, I think that none of those authors that I can tell really does the raconteur as immediate narrator that Lafferty does. So that would be one difference amongst others. But the other being that unsettler quality that sees the land doing things to the humans rather than humans doing things to the land. Although that, I think you will see some of that in some of these other writers. I do see that a bit in Faulkner. You see it, I think, a lot in Cormac McCarthy, for example. So Lafferty doesn't write Westerns, I wouldn't say. But I do think there's a little feel of that here and there in Lafferty's fiction. So I think that's a little bit in there. And this is a really good little short book on science fiction and the genre of Westerns and gets into the frontier thesis, Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis. And notes that the genre of the Western only grew up after the frontier was declared closed and like that era had ended, and then there became this nostalgia by which, you know, in which the Westerns, you know, fill that gap. And he talks about how, you know, science fiction and its exploration of planets and stuff kind of creates a new frontier and these sorts of things. And I do think Lafferty fits within that to a certain degree. I think his planetary stories are very much that frontier type of thing. But again, there's still that unsettler fiction. They've like taken that bioregional unsettler fiction to the stars, you know, to where, you know, there's always, you know, just think of Snuffles again, if you know that story, and many others where, you know, the land is doing strange things to the people rather than the other way around. This is the Frontier Thesis from Turner, a book about that. But so you've got people like, I still haven't read enough of all this sort of U.S. Western literature. It's still pretty new to me, but I do really love Willa Cather. I think she is amazing and writes the West in a really amazing way. Very much from a settler perspective. I mean, like, Oh Pioneers is all about Scandinavian and other settler people trying to master, you know, where she comes from, Minnesota, Wisconsin type area. And, you know, so it's very much about that. But I do think it does some interesting things to make that strange as well. And she's from there and she stays there and writes about that. And then she writes a Southwestern novel that I've never finished just because I picked it up on a whim, got halfway through and got busy with life. And I'm dying to get back to it because it's one of my favorite things I've ever read. Death Comes for the Archbishop. And it's, you know, these priests and so on in like New Mexico, I think it is, and historical and stuff. So it's really quite Laffertian in a lot of respects. I think there could be some good comparison there. And of course, I've mentioned many times Cormac McCarthy. And just let me say about McCarthy, it might seem like the strangest sort of connection to make with Lafferty to a lot of people. But I tell you, I didn't mean to make it. What I'd found, I'd been reading Lafferty for years, and then I discovered McCarthy very late in the game. I discovered him through the film No Country for Old Men, found out it was based on a novel, went and read it, and was like, oh my God, how have I been living without this in my life? You know, and started to read all his stuff, and I just, he became a very, very favorite author. I mean, he's really tied for me with Lafferty and maybe a few others, but certainly Lafferty and McCarthy are two of my all-time favorites. I know, old white guys and all that, but I have other favorites that don't fit that mold. But anyway, and as I was reading, I noticed, and I'll need to go and like find the exact words and things because I don't have them to hand and I don't recall them exactly. But I noticed in particular, there were words about sort of Western, Southwestern material culture that I had never seen anywhere but Lafferty and McCarthy. And I was reading McCarthy and I was like, hey, Lafferty says that. Lafferty uses that term, about, whether it's landscape, chaparral or whatever. And I know other people will say that kind of thing. Or, things about, I just can't remember. I feel like they both talk about this kind of whip called a remora or something like that. I can't even remember. Anyway, but they talk about these sort of material particularities of Southwestern nature culture. And there's an overlap there. And that was actually when I clocked Lafferty as a regional, bioregional, Western, Southwestern sort of writer. Now, you always know that when you're reading Lafferty. He'll have characters talk in the vernacular to some degree, and you just you do get that flavor, but I don't think it's always clocked, and especially because a lot of times I think we're overly bent on locating Lafferty as a science fiction writer exclusively, and he just doesn't entirely fit that category. And even though we'll say he doesn't fit that category, we still kind of then just go on to place him as a science fiction writer. But once you kind of let that loosen a little bit, I think you see even more what a U.S. Western writer he is. But it was through reading McCarthy that I started to clock this. So, it's not something I went out to find. It's just like, oh, and that's when I thought more and more about it, and I realized I think these guys in a strange way can be compared, even though they might seem tonally so different. They're not as if you look closely, they're not as tonally different as you might imagine. And I wrote only one chapter, but a long chapter on Blood Meridian, kind of mainly showing how McCarthy isn't a total nihilist like he seems. He's dark as hell, but it's not pure nihilism, and he couldn't be ecological if it was pure nihilism. And he is very ecological, and then I do a little bit of tracery between him and Lafferty, and I do think it's there, for what it's worth. But in addition to these sorts of Western authors of U.S. Western literature, some of the Native American authors that I've compared with Lafferty in the past and in my thesis and stuff are also from these Western locations, okay, and write as Westerners, as U.S. Westerners. There's a Native American literary renaissance that happens in around 68 or the 60s that was noted, and Scott Momaday, I think, has a lot to do with that. His first novel, House Made of Dawn, which is amazing. Only finally got around to reading this in the past year or two. It's really incredible. But Geary Hobson is the one who wrote the introduction to Oklahanali. Oops, I've got a stack of books that are going to topple. Geary Hobson wrote the intro to Oklahanali, and he's a Cherokee Chickasaw novelist, poet, essayist. And he put together this kind of groundbreaking work called The Remembered Earth that collected a lot of contemporary Native American short fiction. Some really great stuff in here, and some essays and things too. Joy Harjo, who became more recently, I think, the American Poet Laureate, has an early essay in here called Oklahoma, the Prairie of Words, which is really good, and I've drawn on. She talks about the land being a dream, and I really think that Lafferty does that same kind of dream. The land is a dream. We are in. There's dream qualities. There's phantasmagorical qualities to the way Lafferty writes the real, actual landscape. And I think that's another resonance with Native American literature. But so I place him with people like Momaday and stuff. Now, the work that I drew on in my thesis was this sort of memoir piece, The Way to Rainy Mountain by Momaday, that I think does a lot of it. You know, it kind of shows, I think I mentioned this last time, it shows how Native Americans use their traditional storytelling in contemporary settings to kind of interpret life and stuff, and has those qualities of the eco-monstrous that resonate with what Lafferty does. So yeah, and now here's a difference I want to draw with Lafferty and these U.S. Western writers, right? That's really interesting to me. Typically, when you read Western and Southwestern sort of writers, one of the emphases is, as you'd expect, the landscape. And basically like its epic qualities, its austere aridity, or the sheer distance and things like that. And it's very powerful because it's a powerful landscape and it inspires powerful writing. Now, Lafferty doesn't really do that. I mean, there's a bit here and there. He writes about the West very, very differently. And maybe this is another reason it's not immediately clocked. But he writes in a much smaller way about it, a much more focused way about the West that's into these particulars. Now, these other Western authors do also write about particulars as well as that sort of epic scape. And, you know, and like Blood Meridian is full of both the particular or the small and the large in really, you know, awesome ways. But Lafferty kind of more exclusively focuses on closer at hand things, whether it's, you know, a guy chasing around or like touring around like hot springs in Oklahoma and thereabouts in, Love Affair with 10,000 Springs. And he comes upon one where a version of a sort of naiad, which one's the river one? Naiad? I'm going to say naiad. Comes out of the spring. It's a woman who's like, I don't know, 8 or 9 feet tall or something. And she carries the guy around on her shoulders and kisses him a bunch. And it's like all watery and wet and all. And it just gets weirder from there. It's really cool. But, you know, like that focus on like a spring or something like that, as well as, you know, focuses on particular animals or whatever it may be. And that's how he writes the West. Now, in this excellent sort of groundbreaking Native American novel, Ceremony by Leslie Marmon Silko, was the first one I came across that I thought it is a little different than the other ones. And certainly if you compare it directly with Momaday, it doesn't have as much of that epic quality. It does do some of that sort of big landscape type stuff, but not nearly as much. And it is a little more focused on the particular and what she talks about, the web of being type of thing, which when I was reading, I was like, okay, this is a little more like Lafferty. So, you know, you find those kind of differences and similarities. There's another Native American author, Gerald Visner, who writes more of the Northwest, I think. I can't remember exactly where. But he's very Laffertian, and I think he starts out a little later than Lafferty did, but not much later. So there's some overlap there. And this is the only thing I've read so far, and I haven't even completed it. It's quite dense and a little bit difficult, but super fun and, you know, crazy. It's wild, bear heart. And, you know, there's a speculative inventiveness that very much reminds me of Lafferty, and linguistic inventiveness, and so on. It's very different as well, but and the way it works with animals and humans and different things like that is, reminds me so much of Lafferty. So another sort of U.S. Western author that maybe comes a little closer to being comparable to Lafferty. And he was a big inspiration on Stephen Graham Jones, who right now might be my favorite sort of contemporary, living, working right now sort of author. And I'm working on an essay, a chapter about him in his zombie fiction. But yeah, he's Blackfeet Native American. And he grew up in Texas, so he writes a lot about Texas, but also Montana, where his Blackfeet, you know, heritage comes from, and also ranges into that old Southwest, you know, type of area. I do have the book for this. I don't know why it's sitting here without the book, but you know, in his werewolf novel, Mongrels is kind of more of that old Southwest type setting. I think it ranges around from like Arkansas down to Florida and stuff. but yeah, and so I'm not surprised that I find resonances with Lafferty in him as well, since I already feel them in Visner, who is an influence on Stephen Graham Jones. But so yeah, another U.S. Western author who is still lives in the West. He's in Colorado now, but and who's Native American. So that's that's the kind of stuff I locate Lafferty with. This first debut novel by Jones really reminds me of Lafferty. It's a wild ride, man. It's like these dense sentences with so much going on. I mean, Lafferty's not so much like that. Lafferty does do that a bit, but it's something about the whole just sparkling inventiveness and speculative quality of like a million things going on at once, and kind of semi-sentient, cars, Trans Am or whatever, and different things that remind me of Lafferty and so on. So yeah, there's interesting things to say about Lafferty in that regard. And before I do a pivot to a different kind of American literature here, let me just say, kind of in relation to the Western stuff, that I do think that Lafferty can be placed also as a sort of environmental writer or ecological writer. He's like totally different than Thoreau, in a lot of ways. And Thoreau wrote about the East. He's more like a Aldo Leopold, who wrote of the West. And there's like interesting stuff in here about like thinking like a mountain and stuff that reminds me very much of Lafferty. But like a collection like like this collection, does all these like landscape terms and stuff and explains them. And like I referenced it so much just to, what's Lafferty talking about here when he says, draw or an escarpment or, rim rock, or what have you, and they got entries on that. And it's by U.S. Western authors mainly, although it's a guide to the American landscape, so there must be other stuff. That's just all the stuff I looked up. But when they're talking about landscape features unique to the West, it's from U.S. Western writers. And in fact, Stephen Graham Jones has an entry or two in here, I believe. But yeah, and this collects like fiction stories and excerpts from novels and stuff like Silko and Momaday and, other, Thoreau and whoever, so nonfiction as well. But Lafferty, you could definitely put a story by Lafferty in here, Continued on Next Rock, or All Pieces of a River Shore, or Narrow Valley, and so on, would all fit nicely in there. So I do think he's like a writer of like sort of environmental fiction to a certain degree. And I might even do a whole separate video just on that and like try to read some excerpts and stuff. But I do want to give one example here. This is from Lafferty's short story, Urima's Dam, from 1970, I don't know, 2 or something. Usually I know these dates like off by heart, but I think I don't think about this story enough. And this story is not really one of his bioregional tales like some of the other ones that I've mentioned. It is about a boy who is so-called too stupid to do his homework assignments, so he invents machines to do them for him and gets the machines to do all kinds of things for him. But it's a story about stupidity being the mother of invention, etc. And it talks about when he's a little boy, it has this, I've mentioned before, I love Lafferty's lists, and this is a different kind. Because sometimes he'll just like list stuff, list somebody's collection or whatever it may be, and sometimes he has like a reason to list out these things. And in this case, it's about this boy's learning abilities. His name is Albert. When, about the middle of his 9th year, Albert made a breakthrough at telling his right hand from his left, he did it by the most ridiculous set of mnemonics ever put together. It had to do with the way a dog turns around before lying down, the direction of whirlpools and whirlwinds, the side a cow is milked from and a horse is mounted from, the direction of twist of oak and sycamore leaves, the maze patterns of rock moss and of tree moss, the cleavage of limestone, the direction of a hawk's wheeling, of a shrike's hunting, and of a snake's coiling, remembering that the mountain boomer is an exception and that it isn't a true snake. the lay of cedar fronds and of balsam fronds, the twist of a hole dug by a skunk and by a badger, remembering pungently that skunks sometimes use old badger holes. Well, Albert finally learned to remember which was right and which was left, but an observant boy would have learned his right hand from his left without all that nonsense. So you get this kind of like swirling, twisting list of all these, natural phenomena, flora, fauna, weather, all sorts of things, which is just so cool. And Lafferty's fiction is filled with that kind of like almost nature writing. And, when you look into the details, he's a naturalist. He's done the work, he knows what he's talking about. So this mountain boomer is actually the name of the Oklahoma State lizard. This skunks using an old badger hole thing was really hard to find details about, but I finally saw somebody writing about it, and it's something that does happen. So, you got those little like, sort of bioregional observational details in his fiction amidst the sort of poetry of the more than human world itself. And it has that quality that some have pointed out about Western writing, and this speaks back to how I was saying he writes the West in a slightly different way than a lot of authors. Rather than the epic, it's focused on the particular. And some scholars have pointed out how whilst we think of the West as being, its like key feature being aridity or distance and things like that, it's been pointed out that it's the thing that's common to all of the West after a certain point in the States is things like extreme variability. This like diversity of weather, biodiversity, fauna and flora and landscape forms and so on is all like incredibly mixed and diverse, and it's just much more so than anything from the East, where it's said that you see kind of large patterns that kind of fit certain areas for all these like natural details, whereas in the West it's a much more, they say it's swirling and dizzying, sort of more than human qualities to it. And Lafferty's fiction kind of evinces that in a list like that, has that, they call it the Mosaic West and things like that as well, and his fiction can have that quality. Now, seemingly moving on to something very different, I do eventually want to look at Lafferty in relation to sort of 60s counterculture sort of writing and stuff that would be very interesting to place his fiction with. He already is placed there through his association with the New Wave, so you've got that. But even outside that, and I remembered reading part of this book, The Old Weird America, and at the time I stopped reading it because I was like, I don't really want to know this much detail about Bob Dylan's basement tapes or whatever. I just wasn't that into it. Now I'm actually much more interested in that era, and I might go back and try to reread and finish this. But when I was glancing back through it, because this phrase always makes me think of Lafferty a bit, The Old Weird America, I noticed there was a very strange parallel with Bob Dylan that I was like, no way. It's just that Dylan and maybe some others were doing this thing where they were reaching back and forward at the same time, reaching back into the American songbook, as it's sometimes called, but like this older tradition of sort of folk songs and different things like that from America, and indeed sometimes related to the frontier and stuff that I've talked about. But that, was strange and, full of, sort of outlaws or, outsiders and, oddities and that kind of thing. And tapping into that but pushing forward into this like unbelievable, sudden sort of countercultural moment, in the States and beyond, this kind of turn in history. And I think Lafferty is kind of in that same little pocket there, reaching back to these older forms of storytelling, but like very much in the moment of the New Wave and so on. So I do think there's something, to look at there. People compare him to Thomas Pynchon all the time, who's not exactly a countercultural writer, but a very experimental writer. And McCarthy's early stuff comes out around the same time as Lafferty as well, in the mid to late 60s. And I do definitely notice some similarities. This is the only book by Pynchon I've read. I don't see it as much as some people seem to think, like they're so much alike, and that's fine if you want to make that argument. But, there's something to be thought about there. You've got your Kurt Vonnegut's and whoever, and I there's the Burroughs and, who's the on the road guy? Kerouac, etc. That I think would be interesting, because sometimes I feel like Lafferty is maybe parodying them a little bit in some of his work. And Ken Kesey might be interesting, who Wolf is writing about here, and these kinds of things. So, I think there's some work to be done there. But I think, one of the two examiners of my PhD said that he was a little disappointed I didn't get into anything like that, and I think that's part, his specialty, so he was interested. But he clearly, he didn't really know of Lafferty beforehand, but he clearly thought, oh, there's some good stuff there, we should compare him with that, So I do think there's something there. And then basically, lastly, of course, it has to be mentioned that Lafferty has, some fellow Catholics, Catholic writers in America that he can be obviously fruitfully placed with and compared with and stuff. I don't have my collection of short stories from O'Connor right now. But definitely I see similarities with him and O'Connor. Again, you might think they're so different. She's, in a way, a lot darker. But Lafferty can be very dark, for one thing. And also, she's very funny. And he's more of a Southwestern rather than Southern writer. But, I do think there's similarities in Lafferty with Southern Gothic. Martin Heavisides, who you will see talking about Lafferty online, did a review of his book Through Elegant Eyes that I talked about in a previous episode with this group of people in Tulsa meeting and doing super weird stuff. He called his review Oklahoma Gothic, and I think he's on to something there. There's something to that. But yeah, so I think, he could be compared with, and there's something to do with like imagery. Obviously, the deep dive into like Catholic theology and stuff that comes through in O'Connor's fiction relates to Lafferty. So there's some work to be done there. Walker Percy actually reminds me a lot of Lafferty and some of his stuff. Oh yeah, this book, in really like in a lot of ways, but Love in the Ruins and Lost in the Cosmos, especially. Lost in the Cosmos is nonfiction, and it reminds me of some of Lafferty's sort of philosophy. And Love in the Ruins, main character is called Tom Moore, a contemporary character, but he's definitely referencing back to Thomas More and Utopia and all that, which is Lafferty's topic in Past Master. And Thomas More is in it. And there's like a strange invention in here and almost post-apocalyptic sort of setting and different things like that. And just the flavor of the humor and the writing style at times, and again, especially in this one, can really remind me of Lafferty. So there's some good stuff to be compared with there. So I won't say more. I think that kind of covers it, just trying to very roughly sketch some ideas of how to place Lafferty in the literary landscape in relation to American literature, which I think, we really need to do that work. I really think he can be placed there fruitfully. So we'll talk next about how to place him with world literature. Thanks for tuning in. Let me know what you think as to whether Lafferty fits as an American author and how, and other people you think he reminds you of, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll see you next time. Take care.